Cool. Hi everyone. Welcome. Thanks for having me. Since this is a smaller group, I want to say I'm going to feel free to interject and actually tell me what you want to get out of this, so I can make sure we can kind of cover this. To that, I'm just kind of curious just to learn a little bit more about you all, just so I can personalize things, or at least try to hit the things that you guys you think are kind of most important. And so one of the first things I'd like to ask is, I put a question in the chat. If you could respond with, one, two, or three, is, just to understand where you are in the journey of building out a data science, machine learning, or kind of AI capability. If you could just go to the chat, read the question. So respond with one is, who here is yet to start or start on a capability. Two is, you started, but it isn't going so well, or maybe you're struggling. And the third is, you started, but things are going, but maybe you're looking for fresh perspectives or a different way to look at it. Cool. Thank you, Sri, Ataliba, Bill. So ones. Okay, 1, 3. All right. Cool. And then the other kind of question I had is if you could type in what industry you're in. So then maybe, if I know the industry, then maybe I can try to, organize, or rather tailor some of the examples, or at least some of what I'm talking about into, that particular context. Cool. We've got some people in healthcare, marketing, oil and gas. Nice. Great. Well, cool. So just a little bit about myself. So I've been in Silicon Valley for over a decade, and I've been at a various kind of few companies. As Stylianos kind of mentioned, I've the CEO of a company called Dagworks, and we're an open source company where we're driving some projects. One called Hamilton, and the other one called Burr, which I need to update the slide. But suffice to say, in terms of with respect to this talk, I was at a company called Stitch Fix, which was famous for having over 100 data scientists. I was helping them build up capabilities by building kind of platform tools and infrastructure. So that's not the only place, but I have a lot of experience from building a company, or seeing a company grow and utilize and build machine learning and AI and build it into a product. So at Stitch Fix, the company was doing over $1 billion in revenue based off of the personalization recommendation systems that the company had built out. And so I'm going to be referencing some of my experience here, and from other kind of consulting or client engagements as well. But otherwise, in terms of explaining a little bit more about what I'm doing and what Dagworks is, and then how this fits in. So suffice to say, in my career, I can kind of characterize what I've been thinking about in this very simple diagram, right? It's a gross oversimplification of things, but effectively the way that I kind of what I've been doing and kind of seeing is with these machine learning data and AI capabilities, you're effectively building some sort of flow chart where you're taking some data, processing it in some way. This is where you're adding your machine learning data to AI, and then the output of that should be some sort of value that's added to the business. But to kind of implement this, you need to write some code. Someone needs to write some code to make this whole this process kind of work. But invariably over time, if you don't structure things well, the code of or that process to go from data to kind of business value can look up ending a bit like a Rube Goldberg machine. Now, Rube Goldberg machines, if you don't know them, I invite you to Google them afterwards. But effectively, they're kind of these contraptions that do these kind of, get from A to B in these funny ways. Unfortunately, a lot of code and kind of pipelines that take this data, build a machine learning AI and data science with, and end up with business value can over time kind of resemble some of this. Now, obviously, I'm being a little facetious here, but suffice to say, that if you're the person who's building it or has to maintain it, if you have to deal with code that kind of ends up looking like this, it's not a fun proposition. And so what am I doing at Dagworks is, so effectively I want to take this process and effectively eliminate or stop the Rube Goldberg machines from taking shape. And the way that I'm kind of approaching it is by trying to help standardize, so that if you do things in a standard way, you're not worried about someone leaving and taking all that knowledge with them because they've done things in a standard way. The business, if you do things in a standard way, you can actually move faster. So you can go from 0 to 1 faster. But then more importantly, as I've kind of described a little bit more, is setting the expectation that, with data science, machine learning, AI, you're going to be iterating on things. And so in which case, if you standardize things and it's from the beginning, then actually your future iterations are going to be faster than they otherwise would be. And so just to bookmark some things, I want to say you should bookmark two of my projects. One's called Hamilton. So if you're building kind of pipelines, that is an open source tool that I think is great for helping standardize things there. And then if you're building and looking to build Gen AI applications, then we have a new framework called Burr that is meant to kind of help you structure and maintain and get those applications out quickly. So in terms of the agenda for today, if I'm going too fast, do slow me down. If you have a question, we have a small group, so don't be shy about raising your hand or putting something to the chat. I'll try to monitor that. But effectively, I'm going to, at a high level, we're going to talk about a little bit of why. So why should you build a capability? Go over some common pitfalls and failures that I have seen in my career that have kind of led to projects being delayed or kind of not working out. And then I'm going to give you my guidance as to, well, how would I go approach about building something from 0 to 1? And then a tactical kind of slide on the skill sets and tooling. So if you want something more practical, that is the one slide there. But because this is a short talk, I'm not going to be able to dive into too much detail there. And then obviously going to summarize the talk so you have a take home. So first up, why? Why build a machine learning data science array capability? Does anyone have an answer or response as to, why a business or why someone should be thinking about building such a capability? Stylianos, if you're there, I might have to pick on you. Does anyone want to type in a response or attempt something? Yeah, if you have a lot of data and you want to make use of it, yeah, machine learning and data science AI can be one way that you could potentially get more value out of it. Anyone else want to chime in with any thoughts or ideas? Yeah, potentially. I mean, there might be efficiencies. So if you can implement, say AI, right, maybe it can actually, improve or do a job better, right? That's one. So that's like improving a capability, right? And doing, improving some internal processes. Yep. Anyone else? Well, the way I like to think about it is that it's a tool, right? And so I think some of your responses we're getting at this, right? And so it can potentially be used as a tool to increase businesses' top line. So say increase revenue. So if there's a better way that you can say market to people, right? Or provide personalizations of things, then you can actually make more money if you implement such a capability. The other is, around bottom line. So this is where, classic cases, customer service, call centers. If you can improve or decrease, the throughput of a customer service person, then, you can actually, save on costs, right? And so machine learning, data science, and AI might be one way that you can kind of do it. And so the high level is, do this so you can, either impact your top line or bottom line of a business. And then with this day and age, especially if you're, startups and things, you might need to do this based on competitiveness, right? And so if your competitors are bringing in, systems and processes that make them more efficient, then for you to stay competitive, you need to kind of bring these in. But ultimately, what they ultimately impact is something along, the top line or the bottom line for a business. And just a note on the pictures. So I do have some pictures, and they're all generated by DALL-E 3. So I thought this was, something fun that I came up with this in this talk was just giving DALL-E the prompts for these slides and then, generating an image. And so suffice to say, the image here, I think, is an interesting one. And so saying, you can grow in the business with, data science, machine learning, and AI. So what are some common pitfalls and failures? Now, if you come across these, it doesn't necessarily mean that your project's going to lead to failure, but it just means, potentially that things can slow you down or things you're going to have to solve. I've grouped them into kind of 4 areas that make sense for me. But obviously there's some sort of, interrelation between some of these 4 groupings. And the first big one that I find is really around measurement. And so you need to be able to measure things so that you could measure the impact that this capability has against the business, right? And so if you can't, right, then you're going to have a little bit of trouble proving the value of what you're doing to the business. Say, so by business metric, I want to mean here, say average order value, or, number of purchases, or, number of, deals closed, right? So I think being able to measure, not being unable to measure what your impact is on the business, can lead you to spot a bother, right? And so you need to be able to also, say you're creating a personalized email system, right? That capability is personalizing emails and providing, better click-through rates to the website. Now, if the business metric ultimately is, say the average shopping cart order value, you also need to be able to attribute and kind of link what you did, say if you, drove people to the website and those people then bought stuff, you're going to make sure then not only can you measure the business metric, but also, attribute that, people came from your particular capability. And so if you can't do that, again, you're going to be in a little bit spot of bother to kind of explain to the exec, what is the value that you're providing to the business. So the other thing that people run into is cycle time. So how long does it take to actually measure impact to the business? So Stitch Fix, for those who don't know, was a sold clothes, and they sold clothes by sending a personalized box to people. It's, in terms of the turnaround time, if you were to change the personalization algorithm, it would take you on the order of about, a few weeks to a month for the algorithm to, recommend things to be processed, clothes to be sent out, people to try them on, and then people to kind of return them. And so you had to incorporate that into your measurement to track things if things are going well. Now, if you're in, a place like healthcare, for example, you might be trying to predict, patient outcomes or better treatments, but the cycle time might be, 6 months to a year to know whether, your intervention kind of played out. And so you need to account for that in terms of, explaining, to people or to exec or to the sponsor as to, how, in terms of when the impact is actually going to happen. And so if you come into a project and you're going to promise something that's going to happen in 3 months, but really, it's going to take you 6 months to a year to measure, right? You're not setting yourself up well to kind of build this capability out. The other, pitfall that I find is sponsor troubles. So does anyone here recognize this image? We got 1 thumbs up. Anyone else? So this is the pointy head boss from Dilbert. So if you don't know Dilbert and you look at pointy head boss, you might get this reference. But effectively, by sponsor troubles, I mean, the person in the business who's sponsoring you kind of, run into issues. And so one is, in my experience, I've kind of lived this kind of firsthand, where there was a lack of kind of clear objectives in bringing machine learning AI into a business capability. So when I was at LinkedIn, they used to have a question answering product. There was a push to revive it and push, some machine learning into it, so that you could kind of recommend, given someone's profile, like what questions they might be able to answer, so that people could then, come back to the website and feel like they're helping people. So I was placed onto it to build out the recommendation portion of it, and so I worked hard for it, but unfortunately, what my work never shipped. Right. And the reason why is because there wasn't a clear business objective that tied it back to LinkedIn's overall goals. And so in which case, when it came to, providing resources and things, it didn't stack up against, the objectives or the priorities of what the exec team have. And so in which case, if you're going to start a project, you're going to make sure you're going to have some sort of clear objective that an executive or a sponsor is willing to stand behind. The other is around we can get into kind of lack of internal alignment troubles. And so say you have the CEO who says, go build the LLM application, or go build that kind of capability. But underneath them, they've got many people who different departments who are running different things. And so in which case, if you don't have alignment between the CEO and everyone else, then you could be put into a situation where you need something from another team. So a classic case is a data science team does the science, but then they need data from an engineering team. If the engineering team isn't aligned with the same objectives in terms of priority, in terms of requiring to help, then you're going to run into friction, or you're going to be not get the data that you need to kind of perform or execute on that particular capability. And so in which case then you need to go up the food chain to management to then get things kind of done. And so this can slow your projects down if there isn't a clear kind of ranking of priorities within the organization with respect to building out its capability. And now, so usually when you're bringing out a new capability, you might be bringing in some sort of expert or a PhD. Another common kind of trouble or pitfall that I've seen is if you can't kind of speak to the level of the business executive. And so if you can't explain simple concepts at that level, then you risk being able to losing them and them not really understanding what's going on. And so this can potentially impact trust or the amount of patience that they have with what you're doing. And so by speaking that level, I mean, you need to be able to explain things like model performance, errors. You need to be able to set expectations. So, is it going to be perfect, or is it going to be, what kind of errors are likely? And so if you can't communicate at their level, then, this is one thing that can kind of cause projects to, not go as far. And then lastly, the execs or sponsors aren't generally the most numerically literate or have, science backgrounds to really understand what you're doing. And so, the media generally often paints an overly rosy picture of things that, AI, machine learning, or data science will solve all their problems. Now, you do need to promise things to get them excited, to get their buy-in. But if you don't temper expectations, right, then they can potentially become frustrated with the progress, or see the first version and be like, hey, this is way different from the vision that I had, right? And so you need to ensure that you're obviously then setting expectations in a way that things are good, that the process and the project is going to be iterative, that you aren't going to necessarily promise the world, or you're going to promise the world, but you're going to start with a very small slice of it to prove things out, right? And so this is another way that I've seen projects not get very far, or reason why some projects not get very far. The third bucket is around data problems, right? So here's an XKCD comic. It's a great comic series. I invite you to look it up if you don't know it. But effectively, the gist is, if you're given some data and you stir it around enough, there's something will pop out of it, right? And so this is a bit of a poke at I think poor quality of data, right? And so if you an example of this. So at Stitch Fix, where this came about, was that, say if you're trying to build optimize click-through rates on your website, but you don't realize that actually there's a lot of bots that crawl the web, and they actually a large portion of your traffic. And so if you're trying to build something to recommend or show based off of this data, then it's not actually going to drive the results that you think it would, because it was trained on bad data. And so at Stitch Fix, this directly translated to, yeah, like someone was building some a statistical model. It didn't take into account that actually a lot of the data was bot traffic. And so when they pushed it out, they didn't get the results they expected, right? And so this is something that you need to kind of look at with these kind of projects. The other is around labels. So you need to make sure your predictions are only going to be as good as the data that you have, right? And so in the world of kind of LLMs, where it's generative AI, you need to have enough labels to say, what is a good response to actually be able to, make sense of, are you, is the model performing as well as it should? And so if you don't have the labels, you're going to struggle. Another classic one is not having enough data, right? And so if you're trying to predict, things that happen infrequently, right, you need to have sufficient amount of that data to be able to predict it properly, right? And so this is then, something when you come to a project, as I'll get to, you need to kind of understand and know, how much data you actually have, and is it actually sufficient for you to actually build, a capability on. The third is around availability, right? And so you might be prototyping and building something, and then want to take it to, plug it back into the business, but then there might be a bit of a disconnect as to what data is available in those two different contexts. So at Stitch Fix, a classic case of this was, at Stitch Fix, when you signed up, you filled out a profile questions to ask users, but those profile questions changed over time. And so, you could be a data scientist and not be, have being in the great communication with the people who are changing profile questions. You might build a model that assumes a certain set of questions, but then realize when you take it to production that actually no one's actually filling out those questions anymore. And so, in which case, you have now spent all this time building something that, it doesn't actually work for where it's intended because, the data you thought was available wasn't. And the fourth is around general buckets around mismatches, right? If you don't know this meme, this is this is fine meme, another kind of favorite of mine. And so what I'm trying to, I guess, embody and showing this meme here is that it's very easy to be the dog, right? It's very easy to kind of think that things are fine, but really, actually, they're not, unless you, and you don't know that unless you have seen it before. And so part of it, the idea is, you got to try to not be the dog. So a place that I've seen mismatches with respect to projects, right, is around staffing. And so, if you're given the green light to be, the first hire or to bring in a data science and machine learning capability, right, you potentially, find someone with that experience. Quite often it could be someone, fresh out of school. And so they're great at modeling, but then, you plop them into the context of your business and they need to deploy things on AWS. But, they've never done that before, right? And then the engineering or support team doesn't have the bandwidth to support them. So in which case, the project requirements in terms of, what's required didn't, the people didn't, so the people weren't a superset of the project requirements to get something out, right? And so I've seen this in many cases where, a data scientist comes in, there's, say an infrastructure team as well, but, they can't actually figure out how to speak the same language. And so in which case, the project doesn't get very far because one doesn't really know how to talk to the other to get the right things or to ask the right questions to understand, how to, get something out into production. Another mismatch that I've seen is around organizational things. So if you're building a new data science capability and the business hasn't built one before, you're likely going to be, trotting, a new path. And so one place that this could manifest is around, security policies or different processes around data and governance that, the business just hasn't thought of before. And so a classic case of this that I ran into was a team was trying to split up a new data science capability, but they wanted to bring in a vendor to help with some of the infrastructure. But this was, completely new to the organization, such that, the security team didn't actually have any policies or process to know how to assess and set this thing up, or to be able to assess and give the green light for this vendor. Needless to say, this delayed the project easily by 3 months, right? While the company or the security team build out the policies and the thinking as to like how they're actually going to do it. But you're going to make sure again that the wider organization capabilities, right, are a superset of the project requirements, not disjoint, right? And then the last one is around technical mismatches, right? And so here I've kind of, the metaphor here is I have a plug, and I have, a British plug, and then I have, an American plug. And so you're gonna make sure that the technical requirements of, where you're going to deploy things actually match where where they're actually going to run in what's called in production when it plugs back into the business. And so the example of this at Stitch Fix was a data scientist wanted to use the programming language R to build out a model, and wanted to take that and to production. Unfortunately, so they developed the R model, the things kind of worked well, but then when they went to take it to production, the R model actually wasn't running fast enough to be able to actually be pushed into production and to provide the capability. And so you're going to make sure that what you're building matches the context where it's going to run, such that you don't run into like, yes, you have a model that works, but you can't get it into production because of some assumptions or requirements that you weren't aware of. And so in this case, the data scientist at Stitch Fix wasn't aware that the model needed to be at least several hundred milliseconds and not take over a second to kind of produce a prediction. So those are the pitfalls that I kind of see, right? And so what's my guidance for starting from 0 to 1? And so my guidance here is can be summed up in this mnemonic mass. So I walk through these, right? And then I have another slide, and then we can kind of summarize and ask questions. So if you think about it, some of these actually mirror a little bit of the pitfalls, but I'm trying to give you a mnemonic here that it's easy to explain, and a framework that you can kind of use and explain to others on your team as you build this kind of capability out. So first is around M for measure, right? And so we have this data science, this is the kind of process of bringing in machine learning data science AI. So you get some data, create a process, that creates some value. You need to be able to measure. You need to be able to measure the capability, so what the model is doing well. So if it's predicting click-through rates, so the model is predicting that. But then if the business values average order value or something, you got to make sure that you can measure and attribute what the impact your capability is having on that business metric. And so make sure that you can measure these, right? And so and then make sure you know how long measurement's going to take. So depending on your context, so healthcare usually takes a little longer than say e-commerce, right? And so oil and gas potentially as well might not, things might take a little longer. So just be aware and cognizant of the capabilities of the metric, and then how long is it going to take to kind of measure and see an improvement. With that, then I think you can then align, right? And so if you're a consultant or someone, you might be brought in to build a capability, but I want to say to do a capability well, you need to understand the measurement aspects of it first, and then that will help set up the alignment. So with those metrics, you can then align on an outcome that you want for the business. This means talking to the exec and getting very clear on it, and then you need to align then on the priorities. So if the organization has 5 priorities, where is it? Is it number 5 or is it number 1? Right. And so that way, when you talk to other people and other teams to get the work done, there's a very clear expectation as to where things sit on everyone's priority stack. And then you got to set the expectation that things are going to be iterative. You're not going to be one and done. Since the world moves, data moves, you're going to be retraining, rebuilding things. And so, in which case, make sure you set the expectation that this is going to be something that is continual and an iterative process. So mass. Now we're on to the second day. So assess. Now this is going to be highly context dependent on your particular circumstances. So you have to figure out what's applicable for you. But the 3 dimensions that I think about assessment is, along people, data, and kind of technical aspects. So with people, you got to make sure that you understand, who in the organization you need to kind of get the work done. So you can use something like RACI, so responsible, accountable, consultant, informed kind of methodology to kind of think through who you need to involve and when, right? And then you also got to make sure that you have the requisite skill set. So if you're in healthcare, do you have the doctor's time or the nurse's time to help label, data? Is it, or in customer service, people to kind of annotate and give you the expertise to, make sure you have, good data. And then you got to make sure that the people that you have fulfill your technical needs. Now, in terms of, with some of these projects, right, people might be fixed and you might not be able to change it, right? So you just got to be, cognizant and aware of what you can change and what you can't, and kind of what's fixed, and kind of work with that. The second one, thing to assess is around data, right? And so getting it to the kind of the pitfalls that I mentioned earlier, right? You want to make sure that you have enough quantity of it, right? And so that's something to assess. Do you actually have enough data to build something statistical, right? Do you have enough data to, provide good examples to an LLM prompt, right? And then you can make sure you have enough quality. So do you have enough ground truth data that you can, teach the model or statistical model or capability to do the right thing? And then the last one is availability, right? So you got to make sure that what you have in development needs to match how you're going to plug it back into the business, right? So this is then, making sure that as you're working through teams and understanding who does what, or you're also mapping out, what data lives in what particular environments and how you can get access to it. The third part to assess is around technical aspects, right? And so, as I said before, some of this might be fixed. So if you're on AWS, you might not be able to change to something easier, right? But you got to make sure that the technical environment matches the skill set of the people that you have for the project. So if you don't have someone who knows how to deploy things on GCP or AWS, and that's required, good thing to flag it and raise it early, right? Then to kind of wait on it later. And then you got to make sure that the technical environment actually matches the business objective. And so, what do I mean by that is that you got to make sure that, when you take something and plug it back into the business, that it can actually function and run properly under the technical requirements that are required for that particular part of the business. So this generally potentially could mean that things need to be returned in 200 milliseconds of a response time, right? And so understanding and knowing what those are up front can then help you ensure that you meet them when you actually go to plug back your capability into the business. And then as you're building things in the 0 to 1 phase, you have to make a decision whether you're going to build things, in-house, or whether you're potentially going to bring a vendor in. Now, vendors are a good way potentially to, if you can bring them into your organization, is to speed things up because they take care of some operational burden, right? And so the goal with kind of 0 to 1 is a little bit to show value, right? And so if you don't have to build quite as much, then and go with the vendor, that's a good place to kind of start. But sometimes with organizational restrictions, that's not the case. So you get to, I want to say, if you're going to build in-house, then look for open source tools to leverage, because they'll be much easier then to maintain as things kind of progress. So the fourth thing, so start simple. So here I gave DALL-E the prompt to draw me Occam's razor. If you don't know Occam's razor, another thing to kind of look up. But effectively, I think what I'm trying to imbue with this kind of part of the mnemonic is do things simply, right? And so the least amount of moving parts, the least amount of kind of assumptions. And why do I think this? Right. Well, the biggest thing, as I've kind of been talking about pitfalls and what to do, is data is really the thing that's going to make or break your capability, right? And so sophisticated modeling techniques, so like deep learning or doing something super fancy and sophisticated, generally aren't the first or the highest order thing that's going to actually show and prove value for the capability that you're building. Instead, it's going to be the data, right? And so so then that means when you're going to implement this capability, you want to use, do the most simple operational thing, given the data that you have, to actually to prove value. All right. And so, so that way it is then easy to either course correct, or B, get more iterations in, is if you do something simple, and you're working towards proving out that you can actually hit and move those target metrics that you aligned on, given what you have. And if you go for the more complex techniques, it's probably going to take more time and probably not going to be the value than just doing something simple. And so what's a manifestation of this, right? And so if you're doing data science or classical machine learning, right, go with simple interpretable models, right? Don't go for the most fancy deep learning thing, right? Start with, linear logistic regression, or XGBoost and trees. I'll share these kind of slides out, but Google actually advocates that, if you have some human intuition and you have looked at the data, then, try actually using heuristics first to make sure that, there is some sort of signal in the data that you have. And then in the world of Gen AI, right, there's a bit of spectrum of things that you could do to build out a capability using them. And so I want to say, don't you don't need anything fancy. Use some sort of foundational model and try one shot properly, right? Make sure that that can move the needle or can show value before trying the more advanced techniques of adding in or fine tuning things. And then lastly, things are going to change, so you're going to need to iterate, right? And so the world changes. These capabilities, they take, they don't necessarily, you don't necessarily build them overnight. In so which cases the world changes, macroeconomic conditions change, maybe competitors do something, right? You need to adjust. And so you need to take that into account. Your data might change. And so this is in the case of, say e-commerce companies or other things, people push out new product features, data sets change. So in which case you need to then update, some of your wording, your assumptions because of it. And so, my point here is, make sure that you're setting an expectation that things are going to be iterative, right? And so because building a capability isn't from a project management perspective, like doing waterfall methodology, it's more agile. But the twist is that it's not like a 2-week agile kind of sprint thing. Most people who I find who are successful do planning cycles that are roughly 4 to 6 weeks, and then they kind of readjust after that. And so, take home from this slide is think iterative and think more agile, but something that takes on the order of 4 to 6 weeks to kind of cycle back around. And so from a technical perspective, I'll give you just a few ideas on kind of skill sets and tooling to kind of, get this capability up and running. So the first is around, more of the people side of things. So you're going to make sure you have a skill set that can communicate. And so if you hire someone, or if this is you, right, you need to be able to talk to the executive at the language and the level that, they understand, right? And so communication helps set expectations. It helps, build trust, right? It helps you, build relations across the organization. So, this is, a pretty key component to getting this capability up. The other is domain expertise. So if you're building, something in healthcare or oil and gas, right, make sure you have the expertise that can help you label and give you the right data to make sure that you actually, are improving things and making things better. And so you're going to make sure you have that domain expertise. And then the technical knowledge to actually execute. So given your circumstance, if you're on AWS or if you're hosting things locally, right, make sure that you have the right the people to get this first kind of version of the capability out and up and running. From the tooling perspective, there's a lot of it depends on your context, right? And so I don't have very good guidance here, other than if you're going to start, I want to say Python is a good place to, or language of choice, just because it has a very rich ecosystem of tools that span the spectrum of, data science, machine learning, AI, and also production systems. So it'll be much easier to find something off the shelf, build it, and then integrate it and plug it back in, just because there's a wide ecosystem. There's also a lot of people who know the Python skill set, right? And so that then from a hiring perspective, there's a larger talent pool. And then, if you are going to start something, I want to say, take a look at the 2 projects that I run, Hamilton and Burr, since I think that will, help you get started and ensure that you can continue to iterate quickly. And then otherwise, from a tactical perspective, what's worked well for me, or the projects that I've seen be successful early on and quickly, is build things that minimize for operational burden, right? And so because to build these capabilities, you need to build some software and run some systems to actually make it work. Try to go for the least moving parts. So this is where potentially vendors can make sense, right? To simplify some of these first passes. And then otherwise, try to make sure that you're operationally trying to make simple choices. So if the data doesn't fit in a machine, rather than trying to use something like Spark, just try to find a bigger machine, right? And so because that's going to be operationally simpler for you to manage and iterate, rather than then having to go manage another entire kind of subsystem that potentially can handle and scale more data. And so it's very easy to over optimize on these things. And so point here is, start simple and try to keep it that way. So take home. So one is, for my guidance here, is remember this mass mnemonic, right? You want to make sure that you can measure. So measure the business, so the capability of the model or the what you're kind of building, but also the business metrics that you think it should be able to impact. Without that, it's very then hard to align or kind of set and establish the value that you're kind of providing to the business. So make sure you can measure. With that, if you can measure, then it's much easier then to align with the sponsors and stakeholders in the business as to what you're doing, what you measure, what you're going to impact, and then also how long it's roughly going to take. You then need to assess, do you have the right ingredients and mixture of people, data, and technical skills to kind of implement and execute, right? And so this is a little bit of making sure that you understand, who the people are, whether you're running on AWS, what skills you need, what are the production requirements of how this would plug back into the business, and so make sure that you have a sense on that. And then with that, you can then my advice is to start simple. So try things that the least burdensome and operational way to kind of maintain and manage or get out. And so with classic machine learning and data science, start with the basic approaches, and then with Gen AI, start with foundational models and prompting before trying to decide whether you need to do something fancier or more cost effective. And then make sure that you bring in the thought that you need to iterate, right? And so do more agile kind of planning in terms of in terms of cycling through this particular mnemonic, right? Since at some point you might actually have to adjust what you're measuring to the business after you realize actually some metric might be harder to measure or something might be easier. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for listening. Feel free to connect with me, Stefan at dagworks.io. You can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I do have a blog that kind of blogs a lot around building capabilities and how you can kind of use Hamilton and Burr to kind of build things. But otherwise, with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Yep, thank you, Stefan. Let me find the right emoji for this. Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, any questions from anyone? Yeah, thank you, Nagus. Anyone else?
Yeah, did you get what you came for? If not, ask questions. Thanks, Divya.
Thank you. Okay, here's like a question from Brian.
So Brian, part of it. So who would you typically hire first? A researcher, data scientist, or AI ML engineer? So that's a good question. Part of that, I think it depends a bit on the kind of the assessment, right? In terms of what's actually required to get something out. If there is support from the engineering side, you might be able to have a researcher or a data scientist, right? If not, and then maybe, and they need to do everything themselves, then maybe you need to skew a little bit more to someone with more engineering skill set, right? And so a lot of that question depends a bit on the context of where you're at. So at a larger company with existing infrastructure, probably easier for the data scientist, but if you're a small company or a startup, right, someone who can do more themselves is probably going to be easier or have an easier time doing things than someone who's a pure researcher and has never done the engineering kind of component before. So good question, but yeah, context dependent. Cool, awesome, thanks, Brian.
Perfect. Anyone else? Okay, perfect. So I think if there's nothing else, then I'd like to thank everyone for being here. This presentation will also be available on our blog and YouTube, and everyone is going to receive